If you've done any amount of reading about St. John Bosco's life, you'll find that the heretical group he clashed with the most were the Waldensians. But who were they? What were their beliefs? How did St. John Bosco fight against them? These are all the questions I hope to answer in this episode. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Don Bosco fought against the sect of the Waldensians, who had departed from the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church by rejecting most of the 7 sacraments. The confession of sins was guided by their leaders and didn't require a priest, and they rejected the use of indulgences. Baptism was to be by full immersion in water only and wasn't administered to infants. Eventually, the elements of the Eucharist, bread and wine, were regarded as symbols only, and they denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, virginity of Our Lady, the notion of purgatory, and of prayers offered for the dead. They continued with word and print to spread their errors among the people, giving 80 liras to anyone who apostatized from Catholicism to their sect. Some of the young men of the festive oratories, who had given Don Bosco serious displeasure and in some issues had worked against him, allowed themselves to be pulled to apostasy by accepting that cursed money. Hence, their rancor sought to vent itself against their former companions, understanding well that they would be regarded as apostates. One evening, Carlo Tomatis returned home around 9 o'clock. Passing by the Church of Our Lady of Consolation, he descended toward the oratory and noticed 2 individuals chasing him. Frightened, he hastened his pace, and so did they. He set off at a run and entered the courtyard and closed the door in time, for if he had delayed a moment longer, there's no telling what they would have done to him. He went at once to narrate the fact to Don Bosco, who arranged for some precautions to protect the community. Joseph Brosio said that Don Bosco suffered greatly from these defections and betrayals. One Sunday, he was preaching in Valdoco against the errors of the Protestants, and with moving words, he complained about those young people who allowed themselves to be deceived by these leaders of impiety, and unmasked the deceptive arts with which they used to draw these youths to certain perdition. Suddenly, he interrupted the sermon, as he was wont to do, and took to questioning some of the children so that they might understand the subject well. At this point, he explained some of the dogmas denied by the Protestants, principally the virginity of Our Lady. Don Bosco became so passionate in developing his argument that his face became resplendent, as if it had been the flame of a torch. Meanwhile, he had begun to give himself with great solicitude to the work of converting heretics. It gave Don Bosco great joy when he could bring someone to the true church. He was often visited by those who were deceived by the Waldensians and had denied the faith. With all compassion, he received them and explained the Catholic truths with great clarity. He then showed them how they had been seduced, putting before them the evil they had accepted, and encouraged them to never despair of God's mercy. At the same time, he helped them as much as he could. After instructing them, some were in need of material assistance, and he would provide for them. Others he received into the oratory so that they might be taken away from the occasion of falling back into error and so that he might better catechize them. Some poor Protestant boys he admitted, instructed, and converted, and brought even entire families back into the fold of Jesus Christ. Some Waldensian recruits came to the oratory more to dispute than to seek conversion, and Don Bosco consented to their debates. And Fossey witnessed many of these disputes that took place, and the subtlety of the arguments that Don Bosco employed was admirable. It appeared that he had not only made a unique study to refute the errors of Protestantism, but that he had a special light from heaven to do so. He did this in such a way that it conveyed a great charity with them. However, they didn't always reciprocate it in a courteous way, but he always treated them with goodness. This he called the most necessary virtue, particularly in dealing with heretics. If they perceive they have lost the argument, they prepare themselves to reject the truth and fight against it. Lively contentions close the door of their hearts, whereas affability would have opened it. St. Francis de Sales was skilled in the art of debate, but he converted more heretics with his gentleness than through preaching. The force of argument without goodness never converted anyone. and more than one of the aforementioned arrogant ones was persuaded by Don Bosco and put back into St. Peter's boat. The so-called Waldensian pastors were not slow to notice the zeal with which Don Bosco was working to make the misled souls return to the Catholic faith. So some came themselves, hoping to refute him and then boast of their accomplishments publicly. But they never succeeded. Meanwhile, he continued to spread a new edition of the pamphlet entitled Notices to Catholics that promoted great good in Piedmont and especially in Turin. He printed them by the thousands. Now, while Don Bosco was fighting the heresy encamped outside the circle of the walls of Valdoco, the ugly beast was attempting to sow discord in the oratory itself. A certain reformed friar minor from the convent of St. Thomas in Turin, Father Vitale Ferrero, who was the brother of some of the younger boys who attended the oratory, had made a close friendship with Don Bosco. He knew how to conceal the wickedness of his heart so well that Don Bosco believed him to be a trusted person and invited him to lunch several times. So in 1852, Don Bosco appointed him to give the sermon on the feast day of St. Francis de Sales. The friar ascended the pulpit and began to speak in the Piedmontese dialect that he knew very well. His descriptions were vivid, and he painted an image of an exhausted St. Francis walking up a mountain to save souls and patching his clothes that he had ruined. He then drew parallels with others who go in carriages and send their clothes to the tailor, and by others, he was alluding to the bishops. He then told a parable of the eagle and the fox. The eagle was above in a tree, and the fox was crawling on the ground, full of foul, disagreeable sores that he wanted to conceal. He tried to hide among the hedges and then go in the midst of the other animals and infect them. But the eagle stood alert, watching all the devious steps of the fox, and then shouted to the other animals, "Beware of the fox!" And Father Ferrero concluded, "My children, do you know who the eagle was? Luther! Do you know who the fox was? The Catholic Church." As he concluded, Don Bosco had listened with immense sorrow up to that point as he hung on every word. Then he advanced toward the pulpit as the friar descended and, taking him by a flap of his cassock, said to him in an energetic voice so that all the young men could hear, "You're not worthy to wear this habit." After a short time, that wretch left the monastery with permission of his superiors under the pretext of attending to his elderly father. However, upon arriving home dressed as a secular priest, he chased his father out into the street, then threw off his habit and ended up giving himself to Protestantism by making a public profession under the guidance of the Waldensian pastor Amadeus Bert. He was sent to London so that he might pervert the Italians living there, and died the same year from a stab wound he received from a compatriot. The unhappy man had gone to preach in the oratory in an agreement with the Protestants. Still, he had not been able to shrewdly restrain himself, immediately throwing off the sheepskin. Those young men who heard him still remembered the ungodly parable in full detail some 40 years later. That tale left an awful impression on their souls. Don Bosco narrated the apostasy of that unhappy man with great sorrow, commending him to their prayers. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to hear about Don Bosco's saintly mother, Mama Margarita, just click on the video I've put on the screen. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.